For everyone who emphasizes on who's the A side, B side, or the biggest draw in the sport, I have an honest question. Why does it matter to you as a fan? Honestly, I would love to know how the monetary gains of a fighter has any sense of persuasion over their fan base. In this video, I'll be looking to dive deeper into the question and see what the possible negative effects could be from the boxing fans' infatuation with the riches or popularity of a fighter. Before I begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel for a lot more unbiased boxing content to come your way. If you're already a sub or have recently just subbed, thanks again. I really appreciate you. I hope you enjoy the video and may you all stay blessed. Now let's get down to business. You see, to a promoter, manager, or someone whose job closely depends on how well his or her boxer is sold to the public as an image or product, it makes complete sense to be absolutely devoted to a fighter's growth in popularity and his ability to sell tickets. In fact, a fighter himself also benefits greatly from putting himself in the public eye, being charming, or in some cases, becoming or adopting a villainous persona, because after all, controversy does sell. However, as a fan, I had relatively little to no interest on the business aspect of the sport, not because I wasn't aware of it or wasn't astonished by the riches someone like Floyd Mayweather Jr. would flaunt, but because a boxer's bank account activity generated little to no interest to me as opposed to their activity inside of a ring. Perhaps I was foolish or blinded at the time, but I also believe that since I share 3 different cultures at this point, and for 2 of those cultures a boxer's finances generally have little to no appeal to the fandom, I was never invested on the business aspect of the sport. However, things tend to get murky once we begin to look at the situation with our goggles off. Look, I'm not saying I don't care if a fighter gets paid peanuts or doesn't get compensated what he deserves. In fact, I wish everyone deserving in the sport whom sacrifices their body, family time, among other things in order to provide us with exciting fights and entertainment deserve to make as much as they possibly can. I want everyone to succeed and reach financial comfort. However, I understand that isn't the case for everyone, and a lot of fighters wind up getting caught in the web of grimy promoters and managers who seek to wring them dry and proceed to discard them once they no longer possess any economic value. But here's the thing, some boxing fans have bastardized a fighter's success and then weaponized it, and thus given said fighter a tool to wield and fend off possible threats or oppress their opponents when it comes to negotiations. Thus, the genesis of a vicious cycle that continues repeating itself until a fighter arises whom chooses to challenge himself, even if it means taking a more dangerous fight for lesser economic compensation, simply because of the merit a potential win over the threatening opponent would bring. Let me give you an example. Currently in the sport, American boxer Errol Spence Jr. has risen to the top level as one of the biggest names and sellers in the game. In his latest fight against Danny Garcia, he was able to generate a live gate of over $2.6 million, putting him ahead of even Canelo in sales in his latest fight against Caleb Smith, where the Mexican star generated 2.3 million live gate. However, the main difference in sales were to the allotted size of permitted attendance due to the COVID pandemic. So although Errol Spence Jr. generated more live gate, his venue also allowed for more fans, thus more sales. Errol fought in front of over 16,000 people, roughly 20% of the venue's capacity, which is 80,000, as opposed to Canelo, whom fought in front of 11,883 fans in a venue with a lesser capacity of 72,000 and thus lesser allowed attendance. Now here's where things get convoluted. One of the biggest fights that could possibly get made that would help establish supreme legacy at welterweight is Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford. However, one of the biggest hurdles for the fight is the purse split. Spence feels like since he's the bigger star and generates the most money, he deserves a 60-40 or even 70-30 split. However, Terence Crawford is widely recognized as the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. His accolades and overall career accomplishments supersede that of Spence Jr.'s. Although Crawford's resume at welterweight pales in comparison to that of Errol's, and Crawford also trails significantly in the department of generating revenue. Although Crawford's lackluster welterweight run is due to him being quote-unquote on the wrong side of the street, meaning he's under contract with the wrong promoter and thus doesn't have the ability to produce or face off with the more challenging and accomplished names in his division. Unlike Errol Spence Jr., who's been able to fatten his resume up with significant names at welterweight because of the vice grip hold the PBC has over the 147 weight limit. But I digress. Now back to the topic. Do you see where the situation becomes extremely blurred? Although Spence Jr. and Crawford mutually need each other in order for them to establish themselves as potentially the best fighter of their generation, the fandom's excessive focus and obsession on a fighter's market value has influenced the fighters themselves and ultimately whether or not certain fights even get made. Errol Spence Jr. is aware that even though he doesn't possess the accolades that Crawford does, his fights, even against lesser names than Crawford, proliferate interest and surplus and thus generate excellent income. This gives Errol Spence Jr. the power to decide whether or not the fight gets made, because he will place on the table the split percentage he pleases, and if Crawford doesn't abide or appease his demands, then Spence Jr. will simply move on and fight whomever, and in theory continue to handsomely get compensated while Crawford continues to long for a significant fight that will define his career. Now allow me to clarify one thing. I have nothing against a fighter knowing his worth or maximizing his gains. However, I do feel like at times we, the fans of the sport, the blood that pumps life into the boxing events, and ultimately stuffs everyone's pockets with our hard-earned money, deserve to get the best fights available. However, I know it's not all one-sided, and in this specific scenario we're discussing, Crawford would have to do his part as well and gamble by potentially taking a smaller purse, but in turn, he could potentially reap much more in benefits if he manages to win. Why? Well, because at this point, not only would he wield the accolades, but will possess the one name on his resume that would connote greatness. So what am I getting at with this? At the end of the day, I could care less who the A side, B side, cash cow, or the biggest draw is. I'm much more invested on who's the best fighter in the ring. Period. And that's where we as fans need to do our part as well. Instead of giving, say, the A-side fighter a pass to avoid a fight because of his unwillingness to give a 55-45 split, or hell, even a 50-50 split, especially for a fight where both fighters need each other equally for their legacies, we need to push for the fights to get made, because ultimately, without our interest and hard-earned cash being handed over to the A-side and their promoters, they cease in being just that. So yeah, I'm glad your favorite fighter is a multimillionaire and has the most cars and the biggest entourages in the sport, but none of that matters in the grand scheme of the sport, because history isn't something a fighter could simply purchase, but instead it's written by the same hand that gambles it all on the biggest fights with unpredictable outcomes. So is Spence Jr. the biggest star in the sport? Potentially. He definitely seems to be gaining ground on Saul Alvarez. However, does that justify the fight between him and Crawford potentially never getting made because of their differences in star power and inability to agree on their purse split? Absolutely not. Now obviously I'm aware that there could be other matters at play in the situation, but I'm merely using this as an example since it is one of the most important and significant fights that could currently be made in the sport. Regardless, I think as fans we get caught up in the undertow of what is usually reserved for a fighter's manager or promoter, and are usually left with the fights that grow stale by the time they actually get made or spoiled during marination. And honestly, as consumers, we will realize how significant our harmonized voices actually are. Those scenarios would cease to exist. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with my point of view, or do you think I'm completely wrong in the entire situation? Is the ability to sell tickets something of high importance when it comes to you following a fighter? Do you think as a fan or fans we have the power bestowed upon us to push and get more significant fights made? I mean, Tyson Fury versus AJ is nearly done and they are massive draws in their country. Although Joshua has more belts and a potentially deeper resume, Fury was still able to secure the fight with him. So why can't our boy stateside follow suit and give us the biggest fights available? Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video and topic at hand. I appreciate you all for tuning in and hearing me out. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe for a lot more unbiased boxing content to come. If you're already a subscriber or a new sub, thank you very much for listening. Like always, this is Shay at King Me Boxing, signing out.